I should have known something was wrong the moment Jack suggested it. His voice was calm, measured, as if he were discussing something as trivial as dinner plans. But his words cut through me like a blade. "We need to transfer your apartment to my mother." At first, I thought I had misheard him. I blinked, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was some kind of joke. But he didn't. He just looked at me expectantly, as if this was the most logical request in the world. What? I felt my stomach drop. I had spent years saving up for this apartment. It was mine. The one thing in my life I had built from the ground up, without help, without compromise. Jack knew that. He had been there when I signed the papers, smiling proudly beside me. And now, he wanted me to just hand it over. He sighed, rubbing his temples like I was the one being unreasonable. "It's just for security, Lillian. You know my mom. She worries a lot about the future. This will protect her. It's temporary. Just a formality. A formality." I studied his face, searching for a trace of the man I had married. The man who had once promised me stability, love, and respect. But something had shifted in him over the past few months. His patience had thinned. His kindness had dulled. And the worst part, I couldn't even pinpoint when it had started. I wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. But Jack kept pushing, his words wrapping around me like a noose. He spoke of responsibility, of love, of how this was the right thing to do. His mother, Carolina, had always been protective of him. Too protective, if I was being honest. At first I had seen it as harmless. She had been strict but welcoming, always checking in, always making sure he was taken care of. I thought it was just her way of showing love. But over time, it became suffocating. She had opinions on everything. What we ate, how we decorated, how often we visited. She scrutinized every decision we made, as if our marriage was an extension of her own life. And Jack let her. He always made excuses, always smoothed things over. Still, I never imagined it would come to this. I wanted to fight. I wanted to refuse. But Jack didn't just ask. He insisted. He reassured me again and again, wearing me down until I couldn't think straight anymore. I told myself it was just paperwork, that it wouldn't change anything, that it was easier to keep the peace than to start a war. So I signed. And that was the moment everything truly began to unravel. In the first days after signing the papers, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed. But that was a lie. I could feel it with every step, with every glance I cast at the walls of my— no longer mine— house. Caroline suddenly exuded a new confidence, a new power, and she seemed to relish it. At first it was subtle. She began coming over more often, staying longer. Before, when she visited, she would at least ask if it was convenient. Now she showed up unannounced, as though she had full access to everything that belonged to me. One day I came home and found a new sofa in the living room. Instead of our soft, cozy one, the one Jack and I had chosen, there stood a massive leather monstrosity, exactly like the one Caroline had in her house. I froze in the doorway, staring at it as if it were an alien invasion. "Oh, darling, do you like it?" Her voice called from the kitchen. I couldn't immediately find the strength to respond. She hadn't just replaced the furniture. She was changing the house itself, pushing me out of it, inch by inch. Jack came home from work and greeted me as if nothing unusual had happened. When I finally gathered the courage to ask why Caroline was making decisions for us, he just shrugged. "It's just a sofa, Lillian. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" It wasn't just a sofa. It was a sign. Weeks passed, and I began noticing how Caroline was claiming more and more space. She started staying over under the pretense that it was hard for her to get home. Then, she began taking part in our family shopping, choosing everything, from groceries to bed linens. She kept an eye on what I was cooking, offering friendly advice on what Jack liked, as if I didn't know my own husband. But the culmination of it all came one morning when I walked into our office and saw her rummaging through my papers. "What are you doing?" My voice sounded sharper than I expected. Caroline didn't even flinch. She pulled out one of the receipts and looked at me as if I were a schoolgirl who hadn't paid for lunch. "I'm just checking if you're paying everything on time. You know how easy it is to forget about bills." Something inside me snapped. I looked at her, the woman who was now running my house, my finances, my life, and realized I was losing control. But the worst was yet to come. I wish I could say that moment was my breaking point. That I had stormed into the bedroom, packed my bags, and walked out, never looking back. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, watching Carolina flip through my papers like she had every right to. And the worst part, Jack didn't seem to care. That night, I confronted him. I told him this had gone too far, that his mother had no business going through my personal documents. But instead of listening, instead of even pretending to understand, he sighed in exasperation, rubbing his temples like I was some hysterical woman blowing things out of proportion. "She's just trying to help," he said dismissively. "You know how she is, Lillian. She worries." Worries. That was his favorite excuse. Carolina didn't intrude. She worried. She didn't manipulate. She worried. She didn't slowly take over my life. She just worried too much. I felt something inside me snap. "That's not an excuse," I said, my voice shaking. "She had no right to touch my things, and you know it." Jack didn't even look at me. He just grabbed his phone and scrolled mindlessly, as if this conversation was beneath him. "You're overreacting. She meant no harm." It was in that moment that I knew I wasn't just fighting Carolina. I was fighting Jack, too. And I was losing. The days blurred together after that. Carolina's presence in the house became permanent. She stopped leaving at night, stopped even pretending that this was still my home. Her things began appearing in our closet, her toiletries lining the bathroom counter. It was as if she was moving in, one possession at a time, replacing me piece by piece. And Jack let it happen. No, he didn't just let it happen. He encouraged it. I started coming home later, dragging out my work hours just to delay stepping through that door. The suffocating tension, the silent war I was losing, the way Jack's eyes no longer softened when he looked at me, it all became unbearable. Then one night, I found the bank statement. It was buried under a pile of mail in the office, likely something Carolina had seen and dismissed as unimportant. But as I skimmed through the numbers, my heart stopped. There were withdrawals, large ones, money that was supposed to be ours, vanishing into an account under Carolina's name. And Jack had been the one to transfer it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about control. This wasn't just about his mother pushing boundaries. This was about something much, much worse. I had been played. I sat there, staring at the bank statement in my shaking hands, the numbers blurring together as my mind raced. This wasn't just a case of Carolina overstaying her welcome. This wasn't just a battle for control of the household. This was theft, deception, betrayal. I had spent years working, saving, and building a life, only for Jack to funnel our money straight into his mother's account without so much as a conversation. How long had this been going on? Had it started the moment I signed the apartment over to her? Was this always the plan? I felt sick. I wanted to storm into the living room where Carolina was undoubtedly watching one of her shows, her feet propped up like she owned the place, and throw the paper in her face. I wanted to demand answers from Jack, force him to look me in the eyes and tell me why he thought this was okay, why he had chosen his mother over me, why he had thrown away everything he had built together. But I did none of those things. Instead, I sat frozen, a deep, suffocating numbness spreading through me. Because I already knew the truth, didn't I? Jack had never seen us as equals. He had never truly respected me, no matter how much he had once pretended to. And Carolina, she had never accepted me. To her, I wasn't a wife. I was an obstacle, an intruder. And now that she had everything she wanted, my apartment, my money, my husband in the palm of her hand, what was left for me? Nothing. I was nothing to them. That night, I barely slept. Jack came to bed late, his side of the mattress dipping under his weight. I kept my eyes closed, my body rigid, listening to the sound of his breathing. I thought about confronting him. I thought about screaming. But what was the point? He wouldn't apologize. He wouldn't even care. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for his attention. I wasn't going to beg for explanations. I was going to do something better. I was going to take back what was mine. I spent the next few days gathering every document I could find, every shred of evidence that connected me to the apartment, to our finances. I stayed quiet, played the role of the obedient wife, even as resentment burned inside me. I let Carolina believe she had won, that I was too weak, too spineless to do anything. And then, when I had everything I needed, I went to a lawyer. The meeting was quick. My situation, unfortunately, wasn't uncommon. Women tricked into giving up their assets, manipulated into financial dependence. But what Carolina and Jack hadn't counted on was that I still had one advantage. Carolina's name was on everything now, and that meant she was responsible. I filed for divorce that same afternoon. When Jack came home that night, he barely glanced at me. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that the world he had built so carefully, the world where he and his mother controlled everything, was about to come crashing down, and I couldn't wait to watch it happen. The next morning I woke up before Jack. I sat at the kitchen table drinking my coffee, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I was back in control. Jack shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, oblivious to what I had done. He didn't notice the way my hands weren't shaking anymore. He didn't notice the steel in my posture, the quiet determination in my eyes. He muttered, grabbing a cup of coffee like it was any other day. I watched him for a moment. This man I had once loved. This man who had so easily betrayed me. I wondered if he had ever truly loved me back, or if I had just been convenient, a means to an end. But it didn't matter anymore. I left the divorce papers on the counter before I went to work. I wanted him to find them on his own, to feel that sharp, cold stab of realization without me saying a word. I didn't need to explain myself. I had already spent too long justifying, compromising, sacrificing. By the time I returned home that evening, I expected a reaction. Anger, disbelief, maybe even an attempt at manipulation. But what I walked into was something I hadn't prepared for. Carolina was sitting on the couch, her face twisted with fury. Jack was pacing the living room, running a hand through his hair. And then they both turned to me. "What the hell is this?" Jack demanded, shaking the divorce papers in his hand. His voice was tight, controlled. But his eyes held something I had never seen before. Panic. I set my purse down calmly, meeting his gaze. "Exactly what it looks like." His mother was the first to speak after that. "You ungrateful little girl," she spat, rising to her feet. "After everything we've done for you?" I let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Everything you've done for me? You mean stealing my apartment? Draining our finances?" I folded my arms. "No, Carolina. You and Jack did this to yourselves." She scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're making a mistake. You think you can just walk away from this?" "I don't think," I corrected, my voice firm. "I know. Jack finally stepped forward, his expression shifting. His anger softened into something else, something almost pleading. "Lillian, come on. You don't have to do this. We can fix this." I narrowed my eyes. "Fix what, Jack? The fact that you stole from me? That you let your mother control our marriage? That you don't even see what you did wrong?" His mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer for that. I turned away, heading for the bedroom. "I'll be out by the weekend," I said over my shoulder. "Enjoy the apartment while you can." Because soon, neither of them would have it. And they had no idea. The weekend came faster than I expected. I packed in silence, boxing up the pieces of my life that I had once thought would be shared with Jack forever. Each item I placed in a suitcase felt like shedding a layer of the person I had been. Naive, trusting, willing to compromise to keep the peace. That woman was gone. Jack hovered in the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Maybe he was still in denial. Maybe he thought that if he let me go through the motions, I'd change my mind at the last minute. Carolina had gone out earlier that morning, probably to spew her venom to some unsuspecting friend about how I was abandoning her son. Good. Let her talk. It wouldn't change anything. Jack finally spoke. "You don't have to leave." I zipped up my suitcase and turned to him. "Yes, I do." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every tense line of his body. "Lillian, we can figure this out. You're upset, I get it. But throwing away our marriage over—" He gestured vaguely at the packed bags. "Over a misunderstanding?" I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. "A misunderstanding? Jack, you stole from me. You manipulated me into signing away my own home. Your mother has been systematically erasing me from my own life, and you let her." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Tell me, was it always the plan? Did you ever actually love me, or was I just convenient until you got what you wanted?" He flinched, and for a split second, I saw something real in his eyes. Guilt. Regret. I would never know. He exhaled sharply. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like," I challenged. "Explain it to me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no explanation, no excuse that could justify what he had done. And he knew it. I grabbed my bags, pushing past him without another word. If I stayed any longer, I might have given in to the temptation to keep fighting, to demand more answers. But I didn't need them. I was done. I walked out the door and didn't look back. 2 weeks later, the real fun began. I had spoken to my lawyer extensively, ensuring that every loose end was tied up before I left. The apartment, as I had suspected, was a ticking time bomb that Jack and Carolina hadn't seen coming. Since everything had been transferred to Carolina's name, since she had insisted on being the sole legal owner, she was now solely responsible for the financial obligations that came with it: the mortgage, the property taxes, the maintenance fees. And thanks to a little legal maneuvering, I had been able to separate myself from any financial ties to it before filing for divorce. In simpler terms, Carolina was now stuck with an expensive apartment she couldn't afford. And Jack, well, he had drained our shared savings thinking he was securing their future. He had no idea that the moment I filed for divorce, half of what was left legally belonged to me. The courts froze the account almost immediately, pending division, which meant that overnight, Jack and his mother went from comfortably manipulating me to drowning in financial quicksand. I didn't hear from either of them for days, and I reveled in the silence. Then, one morning, my phone rang. Jack. I let it go to voicemail, then another call, then another, and finally, a text. "Lillian, please, we need to talk." I stared at the screen, feeling nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just nothing. They had done this to themselves, and now they could live with the consequences. I ignored Jack's messages. Every call, every text, deleted without hesitation. There was nothing left to say. They had taken everything from me, but in doing so they had set me free. A few days later, I received an email from my lawyer. Carolina had officially defaulted on the first mortgage payment. It hadn't taken long. The apartment was far beyond her means, and without my financial contributions, or Jack's dwindling savings, the walls were already caving in. I pictured them, Jack pacing the floor, his mother wringing her hands, scrambling for a solution that didn't exist. I wondered if they had finally turned on each other, if Carolina had finally started blaming her son for his incompetence, if Jack had finally realized his mother wasn't a saint but a parasite, feeding off of his life, his marriage, his future. Not my problem. I was staying in a small rental for the time being, a cozy one-bedroom that felt more like home in a few weeks than the apartment ever had in years. It was mine. The space, the air, the freedom. I had never felt so light. Then, another text. This time, from an unknown number. "Lillian, please. You don't understand what's happening. I need to talk to you." Jack. Again. Curiosity got the better of me. Not enough to call him back, but enough to check online, to see if the disaster had started making waves. A quick search of Carolina's name brought up exactly what I expected. The apartment was up for sale, a desperate, slashed-price listing that screamed of financial ruin. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the second listing. Jack's car, a luxury vehicle he had once been so proud of, the one he had refused to let me drive because it was his. Now, it was sitting on an auction site, a starting bid that barely scratched the surface of its worth. It was happening faster than I thought. Their downfall, their collapse. And yet, it still wasn't my problem, until I got another message. "You were right about her." I froze. Jack had never admitted fault. Not once. Not throughout the slow suffocation of our marriage. Not during the manipulation. Not when he had drained our finances. But now he was. A second message followed. "Please. She's ruined everything." I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the messages, just like I had before. But something about it stuck. What had happened between them? Had Carolina finally turned on her son completely? Had Jack realized too late that he had been nothing more than a pawn in her game? I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the screen. And then, against my better judgment, I typed back. Not my problem, and I meant it. Or at least, I thought I did. Until Jack showed up at my door. I had just poured myself a glass of wine when I heard the knock. A sharp, insistent rhythm that sent an immediate ripple of unease through me. No one ever knocked on my door this late. I froze, my fingers tightening around the glass. A part of me already knew who it was, but I didn't want to believe it. Slowly, I set the wine down and moved toward the door, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. Another knock, this time more desperate. I peeked through the peephole. Jack. He looked terrible. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his face unshaven, his clothes wrinkled as if he hadn't changed in days. His eyes were wild, darting around the hallway like he was afraid someone was watching him. I should have ignored him, locked the door, pretended I wasn't home. But against all logic, I cracked the door open just an inch. "What the hell are you doing here?" He exhaled shakily. "Lillian, please, let me in." I scoffed. Why on earth would I do that? He swallowed, glancing behind him. "I have nowhere else to go." I almost laughed. The sheer irony of it. He had taken everything from me, sided with his mother, stolen my home, and now, after all of that, he had the audacity to show up here, asking for my help, I moved to shut the door, but he reached out, pressing a trembling hand against it. "Wait," he pleaded. "You don't understand. She's lost her mind, Lily, and she's dangerous." A bitter taste filled my mouth. "You just figured that out?" "No." His eyes darkened. "I knew. I always knew. But I didn't think she'd turn on me." I hesitated. Not because I cared. Those days were long gone. But because I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear how it had all crumbled. "What happened?" Jack glanced down the hall again, then lowered his voice. "Can I come in?" "Just for a minute?" I should have said no. Every instinct screamed at me to shut the door, to leave him out there to deal with the mess he had created. But something about the way he looked, the absolute wreckage in his eyes, made me pause. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. Jack slipped inside quickly, as if expecting someone to grab him from behind. He stood in the center of my small apartment, looking so out of place, so utterly broken, that for the first time in years, I didn't recognize him. I crossed my arms. "Start talking." He dragged a hand down his face, exhaling shakily. "She drained everything." I frowned. "What?" "My accounts. Our joint savings. The money I had left after you took your share." His jaw clenched. "She took it all, Lillian. Every last cent. The apartment, the mortgage. I thought she had some plan to keep up with the payments, but she didn't. She let it all go. And when I confronted her, she just..." He shook his head, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She laughed." A chill ran down my spine. Jack looked up at me, something desperate and unhinged in his eyes. "She told me I was never supposed to leave her, that I was supposed to take care of her, that my marriage was just a distraction. She said she did everything for me." He let out a hollow laugh. "Everything. She destroyed me." I took a slow step back. "So what do you want from me?" His lips parted, but he didn't answer right away. And then softly, "I don't know." For the first time, I believed him. Jack had never been the master manipulator I had once thought he was. He was just another puppet, another casualty of Carolina's suffocating control, but I had no sympathy left for him. "You need to leave," I said firmly. "Whatever happens next, it's not my problem." Jack's shoulders sagged. He nodded slowly, rubbing his temples like he was trying to process everything. He turned toward the door, but then he hesitated. "There's something else." I sighed. "Of course there is." He swallowed hard. "I don't think she's done yet." A cold sensation crept over my skin. "What do you mean?" Jack looked at me, his expression unreadable. "She's been asking about you." My stomach clenched. "What?" He took a slow breath. "Before I left, she kept talking about how you ruined everything, how it was all your fault. She's obsessed, Lillian. I don't know what she's planning, but be careful." My pulse pounded in my ears. Jack had been weak, foolish, selfish. But Carolina, she was something else entirely. I walked to the door and pulled it open. "Get out, Jack." He hesitated, then stepped into the hallway. I shut the door behind him, locked it, and leaned against the wood, my heart hammering. I had thought this was over, but I was wrong. It wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't sleep that night. Jack's warning echoed in my mind like an alarm I couldn't shut off. Carolina was obsessed with me. She blamed me for everything. But what could she really do? She had already stolen my home, my money, my peace of mind. What was left? The answer came the next morning when I got a call from the bank. "Ms. Mays, we've detected suspicious activity on your accounts. Someone attempted to gain access to your financial records." My stomach turned to ice. I didn't need to guess who it was. Carolina was desperate. She had drained Jack dry, and now she was coming for me. But this time I was ready. For too long I had let things slide. I had let them take from me, manipulate me, push me into a corner, no more. If Carolina wanted to fight, I was going to give her one. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I had: old bank records, emails, even text messages where Jack had subtly hinted at Carolina's financial schemes. I dug deep into public records, and what I found made my blood run cold. Carolina had been siphoning money from multiple sources for years: fraud, tax evasion, even forging Jack's signature on financial documents. And then I found the key: a property under Jack's name, one I knew for a fact he never bought. A property Carolina had been hiding money in, using him as a cover. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. The authorities moved fast. White-collar crime might not have the same drama as a violent scandal, but when the IRS gets involved, no one walks away unscathed. Carolina was arrested at her home, dragged out in front of the very neighbors she had once looked down on. She screamed. She protested. She tried to blame me. But the evidence was airtight. The woman who had controlled everything, who had dictated every aspect of our lives, was now powerless. Jack, too, was questioned, but for once, I almost felt sorry for him. He wasn't innocent, but he was a pawn in her game. He had let himself be used. When they released him, he showed up at my apartment one last time. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "The house, the money, it's all been seized. They're saying she could face up to 10 years. I nodded, feeling nothing. Not triumph, not sadness. Just closure. "And you?" I asked. Jack gave a bitter laugh. "They didn't charge me, but I have nothing left. No money, no home. Nothing." For a moment he just stood there looking at me like he wanted to say something else. But I had nothing left to give. He took a shaky breath. "Goodbye, Lillian." I watched him walk away. Carolina was convicted of financial fraud and embezzlement. The courtroom was packed the day she was sentenced. She didn't look at me once. Jack disappeared after the trial. Last I heard, he was living in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a dead-end job. The man who had once thought he was untouchable had been reduced to nothing. And me? I got my apartment back. The courts ruled in my favor after it was proven that Carolina had coerced me into signing it over. I sold it immediately and left Los Angeles behind. A fresh start. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new home, sipping wine, I received a text from an unknown number. "Are you happy now?" I stared at it for a long moment before typing my reply. "More than you'll ever be." I hit send, then blocked the number, and with that, I was finally free.